Welcome to Shiloh. If you're new here, welcome. If you've been here for a while, welcome. We're in the middle of a series just being kind of a collection of sermons about a certain topic or an idea. There's two, it's in a sense, it's a series about two different things. One is Plato's cave and how we as people rationalize reality. And the second being the fruits of the Spirit. And my thought being that if we can really examine what is real, and at the same time examine what our lives should be producing based on what the Word says, based on what the Bible teaches us that the life of a Christ follower should produce. My thinking is, if those are the two rails, there's a lot to be looked at. There's a lot to be considered. Maybe you're not from a church background. Maybe you are. And so Plato's cave, here's the basic explanation, is that if we're trying to understand consciousness, we think of it as like prisoners that have been in a cave their entire lives. And all they know of reality is the shadows that they see on the wall. But one prisoner escapes, he goes out, he sees the world as it actually is, and when he comes back in, how difficult it would be for him to explain reality to the prisoners that didn't go outside also. That's an interesting concept. I think for me, I hear that and I go, okay, I've been raised in a culture that has told me that the world is a certain way, whether that's about the Bible, whether that's about Jesus, whether it's about our cultural, our makeup, and it is so easy to think that is all there is in the world. And so if we can examine like, okay, but what does the Word say and the fruits that are supposed to be produced, we actually get a deeper understanding of what the human experience actually is. Karl Marx, interesting reference, I know, but Karl Marx, one of the things that he said that makes so much sense to me is he said, the problem with religion is that the religious governance is always a reflection of the government that it's under. And he's not wrong. If you look out throughout the history of the church has taken on a governmental system within the church that reflects the governmental system that it's under. And he said that proves that it's a hoax. He said that religion existed to explain away the exploitation of the people of that system. That religion was useful to a governmental system. And if that's true that the church reflects the governmental system, what that says is, as people, we go back to the prisoners in the cave, we apply everything to what we see, whether that's church, whether that's anything else. We would benefit greatly from saying, but what does the Word say? What does the Bible say? Because that's how I go, transcend would be the word, that's how I go beyond just my life experiences, is to look in the Word and see if my experience in life matches the experience I'm supposed to be having in the world. John chapter 16:33 says this. It says, I've told you these things so that in me you may have peace. This is the third week. Love, joy, peace. Peace is what we're examining, and in 2021 seems like a good time to be examining that word. Love, joy, peace. I've told you these things that in this world you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. So much of the culture outside of the church throughout human history, this is what I would say to the Karl Marx explanation. So, the church is made up of people. If the building burns down, the church moves. There, you see this all the time where a church moves into this building, or then it moves over to that building, or this church closes in this church. But the mass it's made up of people, and in that it's made up of imperfect people. And those people are basing their understanding of what goes on inside the church based on their life experiences, and their life experiences exist outside of a church. So of course, a church kind of takes on the shape and the culture of the world around it. We mimic what we know and see, and so if we're not careful, what happens is everything that we see outside of the world, we just assume is what we're supposed to be seeing inside the church. Let's not too far ahead of that, but let me ask you this. In 2021, if you were to walk outside of a church, an American church, and we believe the Bible, and we believe Jesus, and we believe the gospel, and all the things that it says in the world, and we were to look around, what do we see? What is the prevailing theme of what we see outside of the church? Politics. It seems like that you can't go anywhere that the word politics doesn't just come right up to the surface. It is the world that we're living in right now. Everything is a political argument. And one of the things that you start to hear, here's a marker to set up where we're going this morning. Here's a marker that if you're not careful, what happens is you're so inundated with political fights outside of the church that pretty soon you want that to come into the church, and you go, I just wish I had a pastor to take a little stronger political stance. See how quickly this happens? Until eventually the church looks more like the outside world. This is where it all starts. So when you start talking about peace, you got to understand that what we're talking about is completely countercultural. Big important pause. When we talk about peace, That's why the fruits of the Spirit are so important. That's why it's so important that we talk about the fruits of the Spirit, is because what we're seeing represented in the Bible, we are not seeing represented in the world. So when the Bible says that if you're a follower of Christ, one of the fruits that should be produced is peace, and you go, then that means I have to learn something more than my culture is teaching me right now. Peace, let me say it this way. Peace is out of season right now. If peace is a fruit, it's out of season right now. It's the winter. Our peace tree is shut down. It's not the time for peace. It's impractical. It is an impractical practice. Peace, great. I can't be, it would feel like you're in a war zone and there's bullets whizzing by your head and there's things going on and you're kind of wanting to survive, and there's this panic that people want to take on in moments of chaos like we're experiencing right now. And so when the word says peace, it's almost like, I'm going to have to get to that one later. We're not in season for that. It's not the season for avocados. This is not the season for peace. We don't produce those this time of year. And when it says, I've told you these things so that in me you may have peace, okay. Jesus even references this. It's almost like he knew humanity better than we knew ourselves. So that you may have peace. And you go, okay, I'm supposed to have peace. I'm supposed to produce peace. My life is supposed to be this container of peace, okay. In this world, you will have trouble. See, he instantly goes to, you will feel drawn towards the opposite of peace. I'm telling you this so that you can have peace in the times when peace seems improbable or impractical. You will have trouble, but take heart, I've overcome the world. It's saying that peace is going to stand in counterculture to the world that we see outside of the church. Peace that is foreign to the world outside of his body. I think there's a level of peace that we can all agree on. I mean, when you drive down the road, you're operating in peace. I stay in my lane, you stay in your lane. There is a practical version of peace. He's not talking about that. He's talking about an impractical version of peace. One of the things that's interesting, and I feel like I've got 1,000 different things, and I realize that what's going on in my head, it's going to be very hard to put those into words or in sermon form, but I'm going to try. And if you'll just bear with me, I'll try to explain it in a way that makes sense. From 1760 to 1840 was the Industrial Revolution. Some say 1820, 1840. There's some debate. 1760 to 1840, the Industrial Revolution, people started to maximize efficiency. Efficiency was like the theme of the Industrial Revolution. We began to develop things like factories and specialized labor forces. One person didn't do all the jobs. One person did one specific job and got really, really good at it because it increases efficiency. We started to use machines. We started to use things like conveyor belts. We started to produce mass efficiency. And with mass efficiency, we got mass practicality. And mass practicality began to produce mass production. In this little period of time, the world made huge strides towards mass production. We could produce at a way higher rate goods and services, and people became more specialized. And all of a sudden, we began to realize that we can produce enough to keep up with the demand. And then we realized, actually, wait a minute. We as people, we're capable of producing more than the demand, and that's a problem. If you own a factory and you're able to outproduce the market, the only trick is then to what? Increase the demand. Think about this. What drives the machine of mass production? What is the fuel that drives mass production? Mass consumption. What drives mass consumption? Mass unhappiness. Happy people don't go buy things. Content people don't go buy things. And if you're able to outproduce the market and you're trying to adjust the market, then you have to make people unhappy. Let me say it this way. Mass unpeacefulness. Can't have peaceful people. We have to drive things like, stick with me, this is a frustrating concept if it's true. Comparison. Any chance we get to compare, this person has it, you don't. You want it? I'll sell it to you. Oh, they got it. Guess what you need? You need something more. So comparison starts to get a foothold in the market. Fear of missing out. I would be interested to know if 300 years ago people even understood what FOMO was. Competitiveness. This is a big one. You don't just have to have it. You have to have more than the next guy. All of a sudden, the love of conquering, if we've been looking at the last little while, the love of conquering versus the love of wisdom, pretty soon you can't love wisdom. It's impractical. Wisdom is out of season. We need the love of conquering because the love of conquering drives demand. And so every time you turn on your TV, a commercial is based in one thing alone, fear. We have to peddle fear because if we can get people afraid, then we can move people to the direction that we want. This is not conspiratorial. If you're like, uh-oh, here we go. It's really not. Think about what I'm saying. This is why we revisit the fruits of the Spirit, is all of a sudden, en masse, our society and our culture starts to move this way, and we've got the word saying, careful, if you go that way, it will be at the expense of the fruits of the Spirit that I want your lives to produce. Because in order for us to mass sell, we have to mass need. Peace is not in season right now because it's impractical. And I will tell you this. I love practicality. Men, I think probably are geared this direction. Like when I go on a road trip, I don't want to stop. I don't want to go the long route. I want to get there. I want to get up in the morning and I want to drive until I get there. No talking. Everybody, let's just go. Why? Because it's practical. It's the most efficient. You spend the least amount of money. Everything is streamlined. And like my road trip mentality is also the same as like the Industrial Revolution. What is the most efficient, most streamlined, like A to B, beginning to end. Let's just get it done. There used to be a TV show, and I hated it. My wife loved it, but I hated it. I'm probably going to catch some flack for this. But anybody ever watch the show Parenthood? And I know already there's going to be people who are like, oh, how dare you? Here's the problem with Parenthood. Go back and watch a clip. Go back and watch, see if I'm telling you the truth. In the show Parenthood, everybody on screen talked at the exact same time. Every character. And they were trying to demonstrate the chaos of a life and family and teenagers, and I get it, but I would listen to that and I'm like, this just gets on my, I feel triggered. Everybody's, there's no peace. Tell my wife, I'm like, I hate this show. Why? It's telling the story of people. I'm like, I guess if everybody talks at the same time, it's impractical. I can't give a thought. As much as I love practicality, as much as I love the Industrial Revolution, as much as I love efficiency, as much as I am geared in my own personality, as much as I'm geared towards practicality, I am also aware that the enemy is always at work. Always at work. And if you're outside the church, please, we're going to talk about the devil. Hold on. Human nature doesn't need a lot of help. In our most human nature, we are geared towards something holding our highest good. Something holds our highest good, and everything else is dismissed under our highest good. We in the church, under the basis of the Bible, we call those things idols. That not external worship, but internal worship. The thing that we hold in our highest level of priority, that will be called an idol if it's anything other than God. If we're not careful, here's what I know. That mass practicality drives mass production, is driven by mass consumption, is driven by mass unhappiness. Pretty soon what happens is, we don't realize it, slowly at first and then all at once, is that practicality becomes an idol. That's a waste of money. That's a waste of time. I can't do this. I can't do that. That's not important. That won't make me money. That won't save me time. And all of a sudden, we become these machines in our head. In the same way that we saw machines driving the Industrial Revolution, now our brains are the machines, and we're driving production and efficiency. And we're so focused on what's the most efficient that we have become slaves. Stick with me. Slaves to what is practical. I'm going to tell you this. I'll explain it as we go. Peace can be impractical. That person's not right. Why would I forgive that person? You forgive that person. Or what about this? I go through this with my daughter every now and then a little bit because my daughter's got a really strong justice piece. Both of my kids do, but my daughter, if she's right, she's fine with fighting. If she's right, she'll fight. She has no problem having a debate or an argument when she thinks that she's right. And so to tell her, like, you have to set that down even if you're right. Why? Because sometimes peace is impractical. Sometimes peace is more work. Sometimes you can be right, and you have to be the one to put in more work. Peace is more expensive. Sometimes forgiveness and just letting things go is inefficient, and it's more expensive. Peace requires loss. And if peace requires loss or sacrifice, it also requires a love of wisdom. Do you see how countercultural? All of a sudden we've circled back around, and Jesus is going, I'm giving you peace in the midst of a culture that's not peaceful. And keep in mind, we're very driven by the love of conquering, but for peace to make sense, we have to have a love of wisdom, and those two things don't run together. Exodus chapter 3 says this. It says, do not come any closer. This is God talking to Moses. He says, do not come any closer. It's the reintroduction of sacred here, just for a second. Don't come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you're standing is holy ground. God never in the Word ever dismisses what is sacred. See, if we're not careful, we can become so practical that nothing is sacred. And I love when he's talking to Moses, he says, get ready. We're about to accomplish a lot in the timeline of the children of Israel. We're going to go from slaves to free. But to go from slaves to free, it starts with a moment of impractical and sacred. Sacred that is more important than what is practical. If that doesn't make sense, let me explain it this way. This will make sense. Anybody ever watch Lonesome Dove? Like, are you kidding me? Of course we watch Lonesome Dove. Does anybody remember the end of Lonesome Dove, how it ends? It ends with a demonstration of sacred. Impractical, sacred. Gus asks Call, he says, don't bury me up here, bury me in Texas. And he makes him a deal. And at the end of the movie, he's taking his body all the way back to Texas. It didn't make any sense. It was completely impractical. It was more work. It was more expensive, but it was based, it was rooted, it was in the soil of a love, of a relationship. That the sacredness of the relationship outweighed the practicality of the moment. When I say that peace is impractical, this is what I'm talking about. Sometimes you just have to swallow your pride and let it go so that you can produce peace. And I think if we are so geared towards what is practical and what is efficient, we won't be able to do it in those moments. I think about when we spread the ashes of people that we love. That's not practical. Because if it was just based in what is practical, someone goes, I want my ashes buried in the mountains where I was as a kid. You're like, yeah, sure. But you never do it because it's impractical. See how quickly all of a sudden sacred gets lost for what's practical and efficient? Weddings are not efficient. They're not practical. They're expensive. They're time consuming. People give up their money and their time to come be a part of it. Why? Because what we've said is this is a sacred moment. It's a moment that is more important than what is practical. It's the most frustrating part of this whole concept as Jesus is teaching a peace that goes against our culture. They're okay, sacred. We agree sacred's important. Spreading our ashes, Captain Call and Gus McCrae, of course we get that. I watched Jet and I watched a YouTube video the other day about how balloons are made. And they're balloons, little blow-up balloons. Balloons are made by machines that cost millions of dollars. It's interesting. If you want to go look it up, it's YouTube, how balloons are made. You can go look it up. They're made by machines that cost millions of dollars. You go, what are we talking about? Stick with me. Balloons are impractical. But balloons are present when there's a birthday party. Balloons are present when there's a wedding. And all of a sudden now, our capitalistic way of thinking, and I'm a capitalist. I'm not against that. I think it's a fine governmental system. Obviously, there's flaws, but here's what I know, is that we're so entrenched and so rooted in what is practical that even when we start to talk about what's sacred, we drag it back to the practicality. And if we can own what is sacred in someone's life, we control how they spend their money. So we're going to make balloons to the tune of millions and millions and millions of dollars so that we can capture the market, the corner of the market on something that should have been sacred. You go, how's this making sense? The consumer market is competing for what is sacred in your life. It's just cyclical. Like, okay, we're going to sit down what's practical. We're going to go to what's sacred. And they're going, we have something we could sell you for that. It's like we can't get away from it. Everywhere we turn, if we're not careful, everything is driven because our culture is so capitalistic and because our culture is so efficiency and practicality driven. Then pretty soon what happens is even when we try to operate countercultural into sacred, we're dragged back into the original. This is not a simple problem. It's not even simple to identify. Let me give you an example. John chapter 12, verse 1. It says, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany where Lazarus lived, and Jesus raised from the dead. Here, a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. Martha served while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. Then Mary took out a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair. This was a prostitute. And the ointment that she was pouring out on Jesus, this is an ointment that she would have worn around her neck so that she smelled good. Because if you're a prostitute, what's an important element of your work? Smelling good. So what she's doing, there's so much symbolism what's going on. She is taking her most practical, most valued practical asset, and she is pouring it out for what she has deemed sacred. She has taken practical, and she's poured out practical for sacred, and she pours it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. Isn't that interesting that a sacred moment had this rich smell that had been dedicated to a previous occupation and is now being poured out as a sacrifice to Jesus? But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, ready? Who was later to betray him, objected. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. It never gets old when somebody claims spiritual high ground. I've been raised in church. I've seen a lot of people claim spiritual high ground. Well, aren't we going to do this? Well, aren't you going to do that? Well, don't we do this? And when someone takes on this, I have the most sacred. No, I'm the most sacred. Oh, I think it should be this. There is a smell when he's saying like, this is impractical. Judas is saying, this is impractical. That money could have been given to the poor. He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief and the keeper of the money bag. It's ironic, sermon for a different day, that Jesus put Judas, the thief, in charge of the money bag. That's impractical. There's nothing practical about putting a thief in charge of a money bag. It gives you a little glimpse into the makeup of Jesus. He's like, I own everything. What are you going to steal from me? He used to help himself to what was put in it. This could have been sold and given to the poor. There is something that happens in the spiritual endeavor that we have, and I think it's why the world sometimes sniffs it out in church before churches do. I think sometimes the world recognizes our hypocrisy even before we do. When there is a false practicality of that could have been sold and given to the poor. What Judas was saying is, I am sacred. Judas is saying, I'm sacred. There's nothing more sacred than my agenda. I'm the most spiritual. What you're saying is, I'm the most important. I am sacred. My religious practices are the most sacred. And the world's like, ugh. Peace can be dismissed as impractical, and we will struggle. I'm just going to tell you, if the world has, all the way going back to Karl Marx, calling it out. Like I said, sometimes the world recognizes the church's issues before we do. If the culture always sneaks into the church, then practicality will always present itself in a way that makes sense but becomes idolatry, our highest good. Let me give you an example. Sometimes staying in an unhappy marriage isn't practical. We try to streamline what is the most efficient, what makes us the happiest. Giving, let me tell you what, giving, not practical, doesn't make sense. If efficiency and practicality is your highest good, it's always about gaining and conquering. Remember this mass production driven by mass competitiveness. We can't give, we need to take. If we can't teach people how to take, they're never going to want to buy our products. How about this one? You go back to the Old Testament and people would sacrifice children to their idols, and you're like, what? You would give your babies and sacrifice your babies to Molech? That just seems like such a primitive, disturbing thing to do. But they say that babies that are diagnosed in the womb with Down syndrome are too impractical to be born. 80%, as many as 80% of the babies diagnosed with Down syndrome in the womb are aborted. This is not a guilt trip. This shouldn't ever be a guilt trip. It's a reminder that we as people are always capable of sacrificing our children to our idols. That's why God says, don't do it. Your highest good cannot be what is the most efficient or the most practical. It's interesting to me that when Jesus cursed the fig tree that wasn't producing fruit, it wasn't in season. I started by saying peace isn't in season right now. And yet Jesus looked at the fig tree and said, I don't care. This is the fruit that is supposed to be produced in opposition to the culture, not in concert with the culture, not in cooperation with the culture. It says that Jesus says, I can produce peace in your life regardless of the external circumstances. Isaiah 32:16 says it this way. The Lord's justice will dwell in the desert. His righteousness live in the fertile field. Which would you rather live in? Everybody says the fertile field. His righteousness, the right standings. When we are in right standings with God, it talks about right standings with God. Sometimes we get so excited about justice. What is just? What is right? I'm right. I know that I'm right. You're the bad guy. I'm the good guy. And Isaiah is saying that sometimes the justice of God, it doesn't make it wrong, but it produces I mean, that's the idea of the cross, is that if we just want justice and not righteousness, it just burns everything in front of it. Look at the altars and just burned what was there. And sometimes we get so excited about justice that we just burn up everything in our lives, and he's going, but my righteousness. Live in the fertile field. The fruit of that righteousness will be, anybody want to guess? Anybody want to guess? The fruit of that righteousness will be peace. Its effect will be quietness and confidence forever. Confidence. I don't want to skip over that, because I think the society that is the most enslaved to practicality is also the society that's enslaved to poverty. When you look at somebody who's poor, like hungry poor, have you ever heard the saying that a hungry stomach has no ears? Like, there are times where people are in such poverty, they're like, we can't afford impractical things. You don't see people that can't afford food also going out and buying extravagant art. And to a degree, I understand that. I get it. But this consumer market, remember, if you're rich and if you're doing well, one of the things that you do is you go, what is encouraged to do, I'm not saying to do it, please don't do it actually, but when things are going well, you're encouraged to go show off by buying something that's impractical. There is a wealth and impractical element that goes together. And so when you look at what Jesus is saying about the desert and the fertile field, I think this, spiritually, when we are poverty stricken, we are stuck by what's practical. I can't afford to be obedient. I've got to this. I can't why? Because practicality is higher on our list than righteousness. What is the most efficient ranks up here. God says, I want to produce peace in your life. I can't have peace right now. There's something more important to me. If we could live in the wealth and inheritance of who God has told us that he is and who that means that we are, then we can give things away that we don't fully understand, because when we give it away, what we're saying is, I know who my dad is. Peace, I'm going to let that one go. I'm going to forgive it. God will make it right. God's going to work it out. We can begin to demonstrate a peace that is countercultural. It goes back to what Karl Marx said. We become a church that doesn't reflect the culture that surrounds us. In fact, we become a countercultural space where the nature and the heart of God is best reflected. We start to love things more. Because I'm telling you, like Jordan on a road trip, and I'm like, let's just get there. I'm not loving and peaceful and like, hey, how's everybody doing? You guys want to pull over? I'm like, let's go. I'm not demonstrating peace when practicality is my highest good. Let me finish it with this. The Bible says, love your neighbor as yourself. And we always think of that as like, you better love your neighbor. But you're represented in that also. He's saying love your neighbor, which of course we're saying love your neighbor, the way that you love yourself, which is also to say that he wants you to give yourself a break also. Peace is produced when you give people the same benefit of the doubt that you give yourself in moments when you're violating your own conscience. And impractical peace that is impractical, peace that doesn't make sense. And here, the truth is, a lot of times you're capable of doing that for yourself. You're capable of understanding what you meant, not what you said, or what you were trying to do, not what you actually did. I think if we're not careful, pretty soon we're only giving peace to ourselves, and we're not a fruit tree that's producing fruit outward. We're a fig tree that's not producing fruit because it's not in season, and we need it more than they need it. And all of a sudden, we're not loving our neighbor as ourselves, and we're not living in peace. The church isn't demonstrating peace. The church, we walk in, and it's demonstrating political war because that's what we see outside the church. And God's going, wait. You're seeing shadows on a cave wall, but that's not reality. He said, I gave you this so that you would have peace, so that when you walk out into the world and the world goes crazy, you don't lose what I've given you. It's impractical, but you've got an inheritance that goes beyond what is practical. It is loving. It is joyous. It is a life that does not reflect the circumstances that surround it. Let's pray. Lord, I know this has kind of been wordy and heady, and I guess what I would wrap it up with would be this. Lord, help us to understand that sometimes the peace that we're called to produce and that we're called to live in is completely impractical. It's not the most efficient. It looks more like the end of Lonesome Dove than the Industrial Revolution. God, that we're motivated by things that we love and that inspire us, things that bring beauty into the world. God, help us to be the people that bring beauty into a world that is lacking it. God, let your spirit be present in our countenance. Let us be people that reflect a better culture than the one we see represented around us. Pray in Jesus' name, amen.